Hey there, self-care warriors. So this is part 2 of Daddy Issues, Daughters of Narcissistic Fathers. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, be sure to watch, because I do explain why I'm focusing on Daughters of Narcissistic Fathers, and I go into more about the series itself. Part 2 is how Daughters of Narcissistic Fathers can cope too. The affection stopped once daughters reach puberty or may have overstepped boundaries. It is common for parents and teenagers to be engaged in power struggles, especially when it comes to the teenager dating or entering relationships. But with the narcissistic father, the devaluation is excessive and immense during this stage. This is especially true if there was an idealization stage where you were put on the pedestal and your narcissistic father doted upon you. Perhaps your father did show affection and care towards you when you were a toddler or a young child because you were easier to control. However, the tender hugs right after he came home from work or the sweet praise may have come to an abrupt halt as you reached puberty and he found himself confronting a teenage girl that was not as easily policed. For some daughters, affection was never present at all. The narcissistic father may have refused to touch or even care for his infant child and emotionally neglected the daughter throughout her lifespan. Perhaps the narcissistic father chose one daughter as the golden child to spoil and dote upon, while assigning another daughter the role of the scapegoat, barely interacting with her at all, or even going so far as to shun her from his attention altogether. Affection or no affection, the narcissistic father's lack of boundaries can take a disturbing turn. As some daughters of narcissistic fathers can attest to, becoming aware of one's sexuality and entering relationships can be a huge trigger for the narcissistic father's need to micromanage his children, especially his daughters. I mean, when we think about it, this also has a societal and cultural influence as well. You know, daughters are seen to be kind of fragile people who need to be protected at all costs, not just from sexual interactions with others, but also just their awareness of their own sexuality. The narcissistic father believes he owns his children, and your burgeoning sense of independence, as well as interactions with those who challenge his power and authority, like dating partners, can cause him severe narcissistic injury and rage. So this goes beyond just the overprotective father, right? This is about someone who tries to control your every single move, rages when he doesn't get his way, and threatens and punishes you if you disobey. To the narcissistic father, no one is good enough for his little girl, but this belief has even deeper and darker implications. He has a need to ensure that his daughter stays in a state of perpetual childhood so that she is easier to control. So this is a very creepy, disturbing level of bodily control that he exerts. Think of young girls who are given purity rings and they have this weird daddy-daughter relationship and daddy-daughter dances where they kind of act as if her virginity belongs to the father. I always found that creepy. I don't know what you guys think, but I think that's a classic example of how a narcissistic father reacts to his daughters. You know, the idea of her growing up and the idea of her becoming a sexual being, the idea of her exploring new things, of establishing relationships, of noticing the opposite sex or the same sex, whatever her, you know, sexual orientation may be. I think that it's very disturbing and creepy the way that a narcissistic father does it. And of course, this is on the spectrum. There are some narcissistic fathers who are more overprotective than others. And then there are also narcissistic fathers who take it on a whole different deranged level, which I'll talk about soon. Her sexuality and interest in boys or girls as an adolescent challenges his level of control over her and compels him to police and shame her in unhealthy ways. This is also very prevalent in cultures where the sexuality of a young girl is basically disallowed and punished and shamed chronically, right? So it might not be as prevalent in certain cultures, and then it might be even more prevalent in other cultures. He may have instilled in his daughter an over-reliance on his approval, which can be difficult to extricate herself from. The narcissistic father may have engaged in covert emotional incest that parentified his daughter so that she felt that he was the only partner she could turn to. If he struggled with addiction issues, he may have assigned her the role of caretaker, or even more disturbingly, in the absence of a mother in the household, a surrogate surrogate wife figure. So that's the creepy, disturbing thing that I was talking about. This kind of control can also escalate to emotional or even sometimes physical incest, which is horrifying and disgusting and deplorable. He may have substituted emotional connection with financial generosity and control, teaching her that in order to be loved, she had to also be bought, and that whoever did purchase her was entitled to her. So this is about the financial control as well. He's not only trying to control her body, but he's also trying to use his financial generosity as a means to control her, as a means to make her rely upon him and depend upon him. There are many ways that this form of sexual micromanaging and financial micromanaging can manifest, but rest assured, all of them can deplete the child of a sense of security and independence when growing up. According to Dr. Carol McBride, in the most extreme scenarios, a malignant narcissistic father can even cross over to sexual abuse and violence. This is because narcissistic fathers have no boundaries in the ways they see their children. They see them as objects to fulfill their own needs, as extensions of themselves rather than individual human beings. This is true for all narcissistic parents, but I think that the daddy-daughter relationship can take a very creepy and disturbing turn in some cases, where the narcissistic daughter is not just an extension of him, but also belongs to him in a very objectified way. By degrading or devaluing her sexually, they maintain control over the daughter in ways that are damaging beyond words. How to deal. Step 1. Track the journey from idealization to devaluation. Was there a certain point where your narcissistic father stopped idealizing you? Or was there always devaluation and abuse? Learning the trigger point can be helpful in reducing the cognitive dissonance that arises when we've been raised by these types of toxic individuals. As we identified that the point that we were being devalued was also the point where we were becoming more independent, we understand that it was not our fault in any shape or form. This was just a form of control as we started growing up. We may have felt ashamed or even engaged in self-blame as a result of the devaluation and abuse, the withdrawal of love and affection, without realizing that this had more to do with the toxic parents' deficiencies and malignant traits rather than any of our own shortcomings. Step number 2, recognize faulty and negative feedback as attempts to control you. It's helpful to begin to deconstruct and reframe any criticism we received from our narcissistic father as illegitimate nonsense, meant to keep us from establishing our true selves, our authentic selves, and creating relationships that would have facilitated our transition into adulthood in a healthy way. Replace negative feedback and distortions with healthier self-talk. Harness the power of positive affirmations, pattern interrupting thoughts and behaviors that redirect you from your inner critic, and remodel the ways that you've been speaking to yourself. Bring the power and agency back to yourself. Step 3. Gain mastery over your body and sexual agency. As daughters of narcissistic fathers, our sexuality may have been stifled, eroded, or misused to serve the narcissistic father's needs. It's time to regain mastery over our bodies and our sexuality. Some ways of doing this might include reconnecting with a spiritual sense of sexuality that enables us to see our sexuality as sacred rather than shameful, experimenting with self-pleasure and or greater emotional intimacy in our relationships to increase feelings of safety and trust, working with a trauma-informed counselor to unravel any deep-seated core beliefs or triggers that may be holding us back from embracing our sexuality and finding fulfillment in physical intimacy. Narcissistic fathers work hard to maintain power and control over their daughters. It is essential that daughters of toxic parents take their control back and their power back and reclaim their power, emotionally, financially, sexually, and psychologically on the journey to healing. So that was part 2 of the Daddy Issues series. I look forward to seeing you in part 3 in my next video, where I talk about how daughters of narcissistic fathers tend to gravitate towards narcissistic men in adulthood. I'm sure you're going to relate to this. So I'll see you in the next video.